Hey everybody, it's Mr. Cassandra again, presenting lesson 4.2, applying congruence in triangles. Thank you to all of those people who tried their best yesterday. I got a lot of questions and comments. I was able to answer most, if not all of them, hopefully. Hopefully today will go more smoothly and you'll be more comfortable. So lesson 4.2 is about congruent figures. Now, congruent figures can be triangles or quadrilaterals with four sides or pentagons or hexagons. But primarily in geometry, we deal with congruent triangles. So as we learned yesterday, triangles have three sides. We name them with the triangle symbol. So this statement right here says triangle CPN is congruent to triangle BIY. And we call that a congruent statement. Whenever I say triangle blank is congruent to triangle blank, that's called a congruent statement. Now what that congruent statement tells you is that all corresponding angles of two triangles and all corresponding sides are congruent. So it actually gives you 6 pairs of congruent things. It gives you 3 pairs of congruent angles and 3 pairs of congruent sides. So over here, the directions to this problem says copy the congruent triangles shown at the right. So I already labeled it. These were just blank triangles, and I labeled them triangle CPN and triangle BIY. Notice how I marked angle C congruent to angle B because they are both in the first spot of the names of the triangles. And then I marked angle P congruent to angle I because they're both in the second spot. And then I marked angle N congruent to angle Y. So whichever letters are in the first spots, those would be corresponding angles. The second spots, corresponding angles. The third spots, corresponding angles. So when they give you a congruent statement, like in this next set of problems 2 through 7, triangle EFG is congruent to triangle OPQ. What they're saying is angle E is congruent to angle O, angle F is congruent to angle P, and angle G is congruent to angle Q. So the order of the letters does matter. It tells you what the congruent angles are. All right? Also, there's 3 pairs of corresponding congruent sides. So the first 2 letters of this triangle, CP, that is going to be congruent to segment BI. Segment PN is going to be congruent to segment IY, and segment CN, the first and the third letter, are congruent to the first and the third letter here, BY. All right? So when they give you a congruent statement, you mark everything accordingly, and you make your congruent statements like so. And that will help you to do a problem like numbers 2 through 7. So if they tell me that these 2 triangles are congruent, then segment EF, which is the first 2 letters, would be congruent to segment OP. Angle P, which is the second letter of this triangle, is congruent to angle F. Angle G, the third letter, is congruent to angle Q. Now you have to watch out for number 5 and 6 because notice how now they have an equal sign and not a congruent sign. So the measure of angle O, that means they want to know how many degrees it is. Well, the measure of angle O has to be the same as the measure of angle E. And in the problem, they said that the measure of angle E is 110, so the measure of angle O is 110. Same thing with segment QO. The length of segment QO is 7 kilometers, and the length of segment EG is also 7 kilometers. So notice how they are equal in measure. And then this last problem, they scrambled the letters of the first one up. So they wanted to see if you knew to scramble the letters of the second one up so the corresponding letters are still matching. So if triangle EFG is congruent to triangle OPQ, then the G has to still match up with the Q. The F has to still match up with the P, and the E still has to match up with the O. So whenever they ask you to write a congruent statement, then you want to say triangle blank is congruent to triangle blank. Excuse me. So, numbers 8 through 11, it says write a congruent statement for any figures that can be proved congruent. Explain your reasoning. So, the definition of congruent triangles is that all of the corresponding angles are congruent, like in number 8. how they have them marked, and all of the corresponding sides are congruent. So number 8 is really straightforward. There was nothing to figure out here. You just had to state that the triangles were congruent because all their angles and sides were congruent. And then EIG matches up with QOM. Now, you didn't have to name this first triangle EIG. You could have named it GEI if you wanted to. The first one doesn't matter how you label it, but the second one has to match up with the congruent corresponding angles. Now, in number 9, they didn't give you enough information for this chapter because in this chapter they need to give you that all of the parts are congruent. However, we're going to learn that there is a postulate called the side angle side postulate that would apply to this problem in a later chapter, like in chapter 4.4 or 4.5. But we're not doing that yet. So don't worry about number 9. As of right now, there was not enough information to do number 9, but there is to do number 10 and 11. Number 11 had vertical angles, so I marked those. And you would just have to say triangle and then pick any 3 letters you wanted for the first triangle. Let's go with DEG. Is congruent to triangle. Well, let's see. DEG. D matches up with H because they each have one congruent mark. E matches up with, well, itself over here because of the vertical angles. And G matches up with F, right? So there's your congruent statement. Now, there was one other thing in this chapter that I want to point out, and that is the third angles theorem. The third angles theorem says if 2 angles of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles of another triangle, then the third angles must be congruent. So, for example, in this problem here, they told me this angle was 65 and it was congruent to this, so I wrote a 65 there. They said this angle was 45 and it was congruent to this one, so I put a 45 there, which means these remaining angles have to be equal to each other because triangles have to add up to 180 degrees. So if these are both 45 and these are both 65, well then the third angles have to be congruent to each other. So if you look at number 12, for instance, they both have a right angle, right? So those are 90 degrees. Then this is 65 and it's marked congruent to this one, so this one is also 65. That means this last angle here has to be congruent to the third angle over there as well. Because if 2 angles of one triangle are congruent to 2 of the other, the third angles have to be congruent. And these angles would both have to be 25. Why would they have to be 25? Because 65 plus 25 is 90, plus another 90 gives you 180. You can set up algebraic equations for these ones here. So for instance, they tell you that this is 20 degrees, that is 20 degrees. So that means that that's 140 degrees between the 2 of those, which means that this one over here then has to be equal to 40 degrees because 40 plus 140 is 180. All right, so I'm sorry if this was a little bit of a longer video. There was a lot of topics. I wanted to cover them thoroughly for you. Your homework is going to be practice worksheet B in the online resources. Good luck on that. I look forward to talking to you if you need some help. And enjoy your weekend after this, okay? And stay healthy and safe. Miss you guys. Bye.